Here at the Wilson Center, we work to support a lively dialogue on the key issues of the day. We, of course, welcome all views. We encourage people to make their case with facts, not spin, and we seek to bring together the thinkers and the doers, scholars, policymakers, journalists, and the business community, in the belief and in the hope that open exchange leads to better scholarship and better policy. Today, we're pleased to bring together leading scientists and journalists to look at how the media addresses one of the most important and one of the most controversial issues facing the United States and indeed the world, climate change. Reporting on science is not easy. The implications of scientific research have to be connected to public policy. Complex information has to be distilled to inform a general audience. In the case of climate change, the task is even more difficult. First, the media must sort through evolving scientific conclusions on a developing challenge. Second, the media must navigate a thicket of political controversy as the results of scientific research on climate change will have potentially far-reaching implications for public policy. Yet this difficulty is matched only by the importance of the task. The American people and their elected representatives have hard choices to make about climate change. Those choices must be based upon the facts and the best analysis that can be drawn from those facts. As you grapple with these challenges, you will no doubt draw broader lessons about how science is covered and how scientific research interacts with and influences the public dialogue. Today's event is thus a timely and important exercise. It, I understand, marks a culmination in a series of programs sponsored by the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Project on science communications and the news media. I'd like to turn things over now to Jeff Debelle. He is very ably led as the director of the Environmental Change and Security Project, one of the most important projects here we have at the center. Jeff, thank you for your leadership. I turn it over to you now, and we wish all of you a very productive meeting.
Thank you very much, Lee. Appreciate that word of welcome. I want to welcome everyone to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff Debelle, direct the Environmental Change and Security Program, and we're thrilled to be able to host a culminating event, if we can call that, from an awful lot of hard work from an awful lot of very bright and very busy people. And so it's really a tribute to Bud Ward and Tony Sochi, the two folks who you will hear from shortly, who've really spearheaded this effort with funding from the National Science Foundation to bring together the worlds of journalism, science journalism, and the worlds of climate change science. One that we will hear today in some of the very interesting panels we have planned have very different ways of looking at the world in some respects, and very different timelines and very different challenges. And I think as someone who was lucky enough to observe one of these workshops, I think you will see that there was real exchange and real learning on both sides, and I think we've, largely because of the efforts that Bud and Tony have made, and these group of committed individuals really pushed the dialogue forward and the understanding forward. So we're thrilled that the Wilson Center can be a host for an outlet of hearing these conclusions. I'm going to keep my comments very brief. I want to introduce Bud Ward, of environment writer from the journalism side, and Tony Sochi from the American Meteorological Society from the scientific side, the team that has done this, and say that they're going to help walk us through a very busy day of presentations. I would just give one plea up front. After our morning session, we have a buffet lunch for all of you. which is a challenge. But we ask that you move through that very quickly and have your lunch in the dining room. And then because we want Andy Revkin to actually have the best room for multimedia for his presentation today, we're going to all come back in here as opposed to having to watch his PowerPoint on very small screens. We come back here where we can really see it and I understand really hear it as well. And so we're all looking forward to that discussion at lunch and then a final panel. So when we ask you to move to the next room, I just plead that you actually move to the next room and continue your conversations while walking. So Bud and Tony, can I turn the floor over to you to get us started?
Thanks, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here at the Wilson Center for this event, and I'm delighted all you are able to join us. I'm just going to give you a very, very brief background on our project. I'm going to tell you, too, that you're not going to hear any or many or long-winded speeches or PowerPoint presentations today. We have built in extensive time for interaction with you in the audience, so we expect lots of interaction with the panels. That's the way the whole day has been designed. I want to very briefly thank the organizations that made this responsible. In particular, and up front, I want to thank the National Science Foundation Paleoclimate Program in the Division of Atmospheric Sciences for underwriting this rather extraordinary effort we've been in the past several years. And in particular, I'd like to recognize Dave Verardo, who you'll be hearing from later. Dave, will you just show us you're here? Thank you, Dave. I also want to acknowledge and thank the Metcalf Institute for Marine and Environmental Reporting. Metcalf is an affiliation I have at the University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography, and Metcalf is as the principal investigator for this NSF grant, and Sunshine Menezes is here representing Metcalf. I can't say enough about the American Meteorological Society, in particular my partner in this whole project, Tony Sochi, who you'll be hearing from in just a moment. But Tony and I have been in this. This was a pipe dream of ours many years ago, and we were thrilled to be able to begin to make it happen. I also want to thank and acknowledge the involvement and support of the Knight Center for Environmental Journalism at Michigan State University. Jim Detchen is in the second row here. Jim is the director of the Knight Center. He is the only endowed chair of environmental journalism in the United States after a stellar career as an environmental journalist with the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Louisville Courier-Journal, Poughkeepsie, was it Poughkeepsie? Poughkeepsie. Anyway, Jim has been a great proponent and has been extensively involved with our program, and I appreciate that. In particular, I also just very briefly want to thank the Wilson Center and Jeff Debelle, and in particular also Megan Parker, and all of the staff from the Environmental Change and Security Program for helping us come here today and making this possible. So Jeff and all your colleagues, we thank you for that. Very briefly, we've been involved in a 3-year effort to bring leading scientists and journalists from around the country together in an on-the-record, off-deadline exchange of views. The purpose has been to discuss and better understand each other's culture, each other's modus operandi, each other's discipline. What can responsible scientists and independent, responsible, aggressive journalists do together or separately to improve communication of climate science and other important science issues to the American public through the mass media during a time of extraordinary change, as we'll soon hear, in the mass media. Over the past 3 years, we've brought together 120 leading scientists and journalists from around the country as part of this effort. All of the panelists today have been involved in this project as attendees, participants in at least one of the previous workshops. The workshops brought together, I can only say, world-class scientists. So many members of the National Academy of Sciences, so many AAAS fellows, so many, even 2 Nobel Prize winners for 2 solid days as part of the project. The media involvement has been equally outstanding. Everything from Business Week to New York Times to Wall Street Journal to Associated Press to CNN to BBC, Nature, Science, San Diego Union, Tribune, Providence Journal, Seattle Times, the list goes on and on. of journalists and scientific involvement. So that has been also very rewarding and very key. We've held 5 workshops so far. They've been at the University of Rhode Island. They've been at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, the University of Washington in Seattle, Columbia University, Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory in conjunction with the Graduate School of Journalism, and also University of California at Berkeley, again with the Graduate School of Journalism. So 5 workshops. All of those workshop reports, and they're extensive, are online. They're all available to anyone. The participants list is all available. And those can be found, I guess it's a plug, those can be found at environmentwriter.org. The workshop reports are at environmentwriter.org. The top page, the home page, left-hand column will take you to all the workshop reports. With that, let me ask Tony Sochi, my partner in this, to just say a few words before we introduce the first speaker. I will say also that we have a number of representatives on the panel, quite by coincidence, from California and perhaps even from San Diego. And I was struck that they told me they came here to enjoy the cooler weather than they're enjoying currently in Riverside and San Diego and so forth. And I want to thank, I see him in the audience, I want to thank Bob Ryan of the local NBC news meteorologist, Channel 4 in Washington, D.C. And I don't know if Bob can tell us if this weather is going to last at least through the day or not. Through the day. Through the day, there you go, with all the certainty. So let me introduce Tony Sochi.
Thank you, Bud, and thanks, Jeff and the Wilson Center. This is really great in terms of bringing this whole process to fruition. And I have to say that I don't look at this event as the termination of the process, but rather the process itself was a beginning of a discussion that we always hoped would be vastly longer lived than the process we began. This is just the beginning, and we hope the conversation goes on for quite some time, and that the conversation becomes adopted by institutions that have an important role to play. In other words, the science societies, the journalism schools, the science schools, in establishing the curricula. There are many institutional sort of many avenues for institutions to play an important role here, including many of the media institutions, obviously, but there are institutional changes that I think we'll hear a lot about today that are important, and that somewhere along the way the process has to be vested not only in individuals but in institutions as well. And so I want to keep those two things in mind as we go forward here. I don't have much more to say except that the process that Bud described was not ever a Climate 101 primer. We never intended it to be that. It never was that. It was about communication. And while we used many, many, many examples from climate science reporting, those weren't the exclusive examples used. Any examples that we could draw on that we thought had educational value, we would bring them in and use them. And hence why we think that this process and this discussion is not just germane to reporting of climate science, but science in general and maybe reporting in general. I think some of the issues we'll hit on, I think, are we're hearing similar concerns being raised in the coverage of politics or political science. So I think there's a lot of value in this discussion that bleeds over into other things, and certainly climate change is not the only science issue out there, but the way that science is being covered is very much on the table today. With that said, I'm going to turn it back over to Bud, and I want to thank Bud for this has been a really amazing partnership for me, and thank you very much. It's been really successful.
I want to introduce Mark Jerkowitz as the first presenter. Very briefly, the New York Times is cutting its page width by, is it 1.5 or 1.25 inches, Andy? Somewhere in there, 11% of news space. They say they're going to add some pages to make up about half of that, so they're only cutting by 5%. That joins a number of other newspapers. The Wall Street Journal has introduced a concept they call a jewel box. Jewel box means they're going to carry front page advertising in the Wall Street Journal. That'll be a first for the Journal, although they have carried it on front pages of sections. But they're going to start carrying front page ads on the Wall Street Journal. Washington Post, for those of us locally, you can now listen to Washington Post radio. These are the smallest tips of the biggest iceberg indicating media change in the United States. And all of the context of our discussions have taken place in the context of extraordinary, profound changes in news media and communications of news. And to give us a little bit of the setting for that, we've asked Mark Jerkowitz to speak to you about the changing landscape of the media. Mark's the Associate Director with the Project for Excellence in Journalism. Project for Excellence in Journalism has now done, I believe, 3 State of the News Media annual reports. They have become Bibles. They're spectacular. Journalism.org, bookmark it, journalism.org for State of the News Media. Mark, until recently, was, I guess, an end user of some of the work of the Project for Excellence in Journalism. He had been a movie critic and a senior writer with the Boston Phoenix, having returned there after having spent 10 years as a media critic and reporter with the Boston Globe. I believe he was the Globe's first media critic. He also served as ombudsman of the Boston Globe from 95 to 97, and then spent the next 8 or 9 years or so as its media beat reporter. So in that capacity, Mark was an end user of the Project for Excellence Journalism work, and now he is one. So Mark recently joined the project here in Washington, D.C., and I introduced Mark Jerkowitz.
Thank you, Bud. Bud's right. Until recently, very recently, really, I'm about 3 weeks into the job, as a matter of fact, I was from the journalism side of the business, spending about 20 years as a media reporter slash critic and as an ombudsman, which meant that I sort of came from a culture of argument and anecdote. And at the Project for Excellence in Journalism, I'm learning a little bit more about social science and research and fact. Which is an adjustment for me as well. For those of you who don't know, the project is based in Washington, D.C. It is a research-oriented institution that analyzes the behavior of the media without fear or favor. There are a lot of ideological media critics out there that selectively choose what's done in the media and then write about it from their perspective. The project does a lot of content analyses and reports, and then gives you sort of a completely non-ideological, data-based kind of analysis of what's going on. So I myself am making an adjustment. I also want to say that I know there aren't going to be a lot of long-winded speeches today. I have been selected, however, for better or for worse, to give one of the longer-winded ones. The other thing I should say is that Bud is right. I was an end user of the Project for Excellence in Journalism reports for years, and they're big State of the Media annual reports. And what I used to do as a reporter on Deadline trying to write about this was I would call up Tom Rosenstiel, who was the director, and I would say, give me the headline. And the reason that I would say, give me the headline is, to give you an example, is that the 2006 State of the Media report, which is now very prominent online, runs more than 178,000 words, which is about 650 double-spaced pages. It evaluates 9 media sectors by 7 different criteria. It's complicated stuff. It's nuanced stuff. And as a journalist reporting on it, I was always looking for the big nugget and the quick story. Today, I'm going to sort of get into Tom's old shoes and give you guys the basic headline of what we found of the last few years and where we are in the media universe. And I'll start by apologizing to a lot of you out there, because what I'm going to tell you today is not particularly new or shocking. Certainly journalists out there know it. Anybody who pays attention to the journalism business knows it, and Bud's already sort of put his finger on it. We are in an era in the news media of significant, meaningful, and in some ways very frightening transition. We have a lot more questions than answers right now. One of the things that we are doing on our website at the moment is Every Monday, we are posting roundtable discussions with analysts from various sectors of the media universe. And we basically pick 5 practitioners, analysts, experts in various sectors. We email them questions about the future of their industry, and we've posted their responses so you get the sense of kind of a dialogue and a conversation. And we've started with 3 sort of denizens of what we like to call the old media. One is network news, the nightly network news. One is terrestrial radio, and one is the newspaper industry. Let's start for a second with the nightly newscasts, one of which is going to undergo a very dramatic change in the near future. They still command somewhere in the area of 20 million, if not more, viewers a night, making them a mass media. But the average age of that viewer is now about 60 years old, which is not attractive to advertisers. And that audience share has dropped by about 50% in the last 20 years, which is a dramatic drop-off in market share. Now, there are a number of people out there, certainly people who used to do my old job, media critics, breathlessly awaiting the appearance of Katie Couric to see whether or not her gig at CBS is going to somehow change the shape of network nightly news or bring new eyeballs or younger eyeballs or somehow advance it. This is not an industry that has moved rapidly. The biggest change prior to Katie Couric in the last 20 years was when Tom Brokaw decided to stand up and walk around the set at NBC. That passes for sometimes dramatic change. Terrestrial radio, perhaps the big news has been, and the big challenge has been Howard Stern going to satellite. I won't talk a lot about that other than to say that one of the things I found that's interesting and that I've seen several stories indicate, and I'm not sure how good the data are, is that while a number of Stern's loyal fans did in fact follow him over to satellite radio, a number of them didn't. And the chief beneficiary so far of those who stayed behind appears to be NPR. And I'm still trying to figure out what it is about NPR that basically appeals to Howard Stern's core audience. And when I do, I'll let you know if I can come up with anything. The last panel, and the one that currently the roundtable that we're discussing right now, is the newspaper panel. And unless you've been in a coma, you do know the circumstances surrounding the newspaper industry. According to the most recent State of the Media report, newspaper circulation nationally was down a total of about 3% last year, which is part of a long, slow slide. Ad revenues grew modestly, about 2 to 4%, but almost all of that was due to about a 30% growth in online newspaper revenue, as well as the growth in niche publications. Now, I just want to take a second to talk about these niche publications, one of which you have here in Washington. In cities like Washington, New York, and Boston, what's appeared in the last 3 or 4 years is a free commuter tabloid daily newspaper that in some way is the Cliff Notes version of news. It's very easy to read. It's meant to be consumed in a 15-minute public transportation ride. The stories are short. There's a little bit of usually an emphasis on entertainment. In Boston, it's the Metro. Here, it's the Express. In Chicago, it's the Red Eye. In New York, there's actually a war between these two, AM New York and the Metro. And what's interesting is the buy-in of the major media organizations. Obviously, Express here is published by the Washington Post. In the last year or so, the New York Times Company bought 50% of the Metro in Boston. And I will tell you that it is somewhat of a success story there, where you do see people, for better or for worse, who have never had the newspaper habit, younger people, reading this green newspaper that comes free from a box every day. Anecdotally, I can tell you that in the old days, when you rode the subways in Boston, where I'm from, people read the Boston Herald, which was the sort of the tabloid of record. Today they don't. Today they read the Metro, which is an even easier read. Now, we can discuss, frankly, whether or not that's some kind of capitulation to the dumbing down of news, or the idea that, frankly, that seeped in that younger people are never going to get the newspaper habit in the way that other generations have, but it's a major development in niche publications. The other thing that we can say about the newspaper industry, and maybe most importantly, according to the report, is that last year newspaper company stock prices, fell by an average of 20% on Wall Street. We could talk, I could give this whole talk about Wall Street's attitude towards the newspaper industry, one that still comes in with profit margins in many cases of around 20%, an extraordinary number. Suffice it to say that the street does not like the business no matter what, and that has a huge implication on revenue and resources, how they're expended. To give you a sense of how dramatic the sort of issues are in the newspaper industry, I wanted to read very, very briefly from the question we posed, question 7, our last question on the roundtable discussion that we have posted on our website right now, which is this. If you could recommend one thing that the newspaper industry would do differently, what would that be? Now, the first respondent is John Carroll. John Carroll was the editor, is a widely respected newspaper editor in America, who most recently was at the Los Angeles Times, where he oversaw an unbelievable year in which they won 5 Pulitzer Prizes, and who resigned last year largely over differences with the parent company, the Tribune Company, over budget and financial and fiscal issues. Here's what he said in response to that question. The 40-year marriage of journalism and the modern corporation has failed. At the very time newspapers need enlightened stewardship, they are being actively harmed by their owners. Newspapers need a different form of ownership, one that values journalism, believes in public service, and is unwilling, as a matter of principle and of long-term business strategy, to strangle newspapers for their short-term cash. Profit margins merely equal to the average among Fortune 500 companies would be a good start. That would allow newspapers to breathe again, to reverse their circulation losses, and to invest seriously in the online future. Then there's Paul Gnocchio, who is a media analyst from Deutsche Bank. He cuts to the chase. Get a new ad sales force, one that knows how to make cold calls and one that has no history of entitlement. Lou Urenick, a newspaper industry worker who is now the chairman of the journalism department at Boston University, my alma mater, says simply, be bolder in their coverage of news. Seek truth over balance. We'll talk about that a little later. Rick Edmonds, who is an analyst at the Poynter Institute for Media Studies, said, clarify to Wall Street that the News Corps must be kept strong, even at the expense of profit margins and earnings for a period of years, because investments and experimentation in new media is essential too. And finally, Phil Meyer, a kind of a visionary thinker about media, who's the Knight Chair in Journalism at the University of North Carolina, transfer routine content to online, starting with the stock pages. Use the savings to invest in higher quality and more specialized content. Invest in radical experiments to find the right combination of newsprint and online distribution. Those responses suggest an industry in deep transformation and that everyone who's involved with it knows it. There's no more evidence of this, in fact, than the recent history of Knight Ridder. When I'll move out of the newspapers after this. Knight Ridder, until very recently, was not only one of the largest newspaper company owners in the country, but it was considered and had a reputation as one of the finest newspaper stewards in the country, one that valued journalism highly. Frankly, due to shareholder unrest about the company's financial performance, Knight Ridder got out of the newspaper business, recently disseminated, divested, scattered 32 newspapers with a combined 85 Pulitzer Prizes to the winds, selling most of them to McClatchy, but others to Dean Singleton and others to small private owners, leaving a newspaper like the Philadelphia Inquirer, which not that long ago would have been considered one of the 5 or 10 top newspapers in America, lingering and wondering literally about whether it would continue to survive. In an interesting experiment, it's been bought by local private ownership, headed by a local PR executive in Philadelphia who is famous for having disagreed with the newspaper over some of its journalism before and having made that quite evident to some of the journalists there. In theory, the idea of this kind of private ownership is sort of a breath of fresh air in the newspaper business, because people are hoping that a success story financially here might suggest that this is the way to go as opposed to big corporate ownership. On the other hand, there's a real downside to this kind of private ownership, and that is you're not sure, frankly, of the values of the owner, and I think there's a lot of great uncertainty at the Philadelphia Inquirer right now. Still, for all of that, and all of that turmoil, the project, and I would have to agree, suggests that what's actually happening in the media universe is fragmentation and evolution, as opposed to destruction and revolution. It may be commonplace, we just talked about, to show disdain for the demographics of the evening news and to predict its demise. But the bottom line is that Brian Williams, Bob Schieffer, who will soon depart, and Charlie Gibson command a nightly audience that Bill O'Reilly and Larry King can only dream about. It's many times larger than the audience of the biggest and most powerful and most bloviating cable talk show. It may be passé to mock the future of dead tree journalism, but where I come from, the Boston Globe, the clout of the Boston Globe is still unmatched by any other media competitor in the Boston marketplace. The Globe not only obviously was the driving force behind the journalism of the Catholic Church sexual pedophile story that ended up with obviously the resignation of the cardinal there. It just completed another investigative story that drove the president of a major hospital chain out. There is no other media outlet in Boston now or in the foreseeable future that will have the impact of a front page story in the Globe still. And I would also say anecdotally, as somebody who's only been down here for a month, I spent a late afternoon recently looking for a copy of the Washington Post in a number of news boxes and in a number of grocery stores and couldn't find one at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That says something too. The world of online information is exploding. Revenues are growing fast. But as the 2006 State of the Media Report put it, the central economic question in journalism continues to be how long it will take online journalism to become a major economic engine, and if it will ever be as big as print or television. Right now, we know the answer is no, and we're still not sure about working business models online. Let's talk about blogs for a minute, the new frontier of citizen journalism, and a kind of platform that is open, refreshingly open, in its disdain for the so-called MSM, which means mainstream media, and their well-ingrained and entrenched habits. There's a brand new Pew Internet and American Life Project survey out that does find about 12 million American adults blog, and about 57 million American adults say they read blogs. But most blogs do live lives of quiet desperation and go largely unread. And according to that study, 76% of bloggers who were questioned say the main reason they do so is to document and share personal experiences, not to disseminate news or not to make the information world richer unless you consider personal experience as part of that. So in many respects, they're not oops, sorry. I apologize for that. So that in many ways it's not a news or information operation. At this point, frankly, it's even difficult to define the blogosphere and what it is and what it represents and where it's going. We know that they have put a few pelts up on the wall, Dan Rather being one of them, Eason Jordan, a former executive at CNN, being another. But it's still a very... Okay. Oh. We'll say bye-bye here. But it's still a very embryonic sort of platform, and we're not sure where it's going. So how do we make sense of this changing world? The story in the last few years, I think, is documented in the State of the Media reports, is that new technology has dramatically increased the number of places where you can get news and information, often with a serious emphasis on speed. Audiences are sampling, there's no doubt about it, this new media smorgasbord, a combination of it, going to many more places. And what that means is that mass media outlets, and mass media outlets are looking at fewer customers in this spreading, fragmenting universe, fewer eyeballs, and fewer sources of revenue, which means that creates fiscal pressure. And that means finding new sources of revenue. Bud talked about some of the things we've seen, like the discussion of the Wall Street Journal taking ads on page one, the Chicago Tribune also recently indicated it might start to do that, or selling off parts of a weather forecast, or selling specialized content on the web. There have got to be new revenue streams in this environment. Or it means spending cuts, like literally, as Bud alluded to, shrinking the size of newspapers, which has happened before, or getting rid of the stock tables, which is happening all over the place now, or trimming the length of newscasts, or, of course, laying off journalists, something that continues to happen in fairly large numbers. The numbers are a little hazy, but last year it's estimated that close to 1,000 jobs in newspaper journalism, full-time jobs, were lost. And they were lost in companies like the New York Times Company. There were 35 jobs lost in the Boston Globe newsroom. No one expects to get them back. The clear and growing intrusion in this environment of the bottom line into the newsroom and the news product is something that the public is not missing. They are keenly aware of it, and it's affected their view of journalism. One of the more sobering things that's in the 2006, and this is not the 178,000 words, but just a wrap-up, report of the state of the media is this particular trend. At many old media companies, though not all, the decades-long battle at the top between idealists and accountants is now over. The idealists have lost. The troubles of 2005, especially in print, dealt a further blow to the fight for journalism in the public interest. If you argue about public trust today, you will be dismissed as an obstructionist and a romantic, the editor of one of the country's major papers told us privately. An executive at one of the 3 broadcast networks told senior staff members in a meeting last year that, quote, the ethical anvil has been lifted, meaning that producers could dispense with traditional notions of journalistic propriety. One of the most celebrated editors in the country, John Carroll of the Los Angeles Times, stepped down in frustration in 2005, but only after taking weeks to persuade his successor not to join him. The most celebrated journalist still at ABC, Ted Koppel, left for cable, but only after announcing that neither cable news nor network news is amenable to the long form to which he aspired. The most cogent explanation for why journalism in the public interest has lost leverage was probably offered by Polk Laffoon IV, the corporate spokesman of Knight Ridder, who's presumably out of a job right now. I wish there were an identifiable and strong correlation between quality journalism and newspaper sales, he said. It isn't that simple. From here on, at many companies, the fight on behalf of the public interest will come from the rank and file of the newsroom, with the news executive as mediator with the boardroom. There are some notable exceptions, and journalists who work in these situations today consider themselves lucky. Meanwhile, at many new media companies, it is not clear if advocates for the public interest are present at all. 2 years ago, the Project for Excellence in Journalism called this a disconnect over motive between the public and journalists. Journalists, if polled and asked, will tell you, and genuinely believe, many of them, that they are working in the public interest, that there is something unique and sacred about journalism, that it is public service, that the First Amendment means something, that it's not quite the clergy, but it's not quite business as usual either. The public says hooey. The public says you're in it for the money. That's reflected in a survey taken last year in which 75% of the respondents said the media were more interested in attracting a big audience. And I've probably heard the term, you only care about ratings or circulation more than anything in my years as a media critic, compared to only 19% who said they cared more about, quote, informing the public. The project has called this a vicious cycle in which declining audiences lead to newsroom cuts, which reinforces the suspicion that news organizations are more interested in the bottom line than in public service. So this leaves us fundamentally with a number of issues to chew over, but 2 which I think are the most important to think about here. In this kind of environment, who or what will continue to invest the kind of resources needed for sustained quality journalism? And if it isn't the traditional media, who is going to fill the void? Traditionally, there was no doubt that big newspapers and big newsrooms provided those kind of feet on the ground, those kind of bodies, those kind of reporting resources. And frankly, there was a trickle-down effect where major newspapers were in many ways the assignment desk for the rest of the news media. But we know that in recent years, the newspaper industry is cutting back. And I will tell you that in the current climate, the aspect of the newspaper industry that has suffered the most are large daily metros. Local papers, smaller papers that deliver a localized niche, have been much more immune to the monetary and fiscal damage that's been done to the large metros, which are stretched thin and often find themselves sort of conflicted between covering national, international, and local news. So the brunt of the layoffs, the brunt of the problems, the brunt of the cutbacks have come at places like the Chicago Tribune and the Boston Globe in this environment. But the project has also found that local radio has fewer reporters in the field, that local television is narrowing the news menu to crime, mayhem, weather, and sports. And many internet sites don't create original content. They are aggregators. So there's kind of a trickle-down effect here. That has led, according to the current State of the Media report, to what the project calls the new paradox of journalism, in which more outlets cover fewer stories, so we tend to see more accounts of the same handful of stories each day. We do know that there's been an accompanying rise in what we would call citizen and grassroots journalism, and that's a good thing. We've seen that in blogs, internet video, homegrown video of everything from last year's terror blasts in London to the current crisis in the Middle East, in which there was a front-page story about that today in the Post. But let's not get carried away. The project's study shows that only 5% of blog postings contain original reporting. Many websites are aggregators and collectors, and now a number of old media companies rushing to create a better online process and presence are simply asking their veteran news and print journalists to do more online, to start blogging, to start chatting, which is all well and good, but what in effect they are doing is stretching their existing resources even thinner. The PEJ study concluded that in this environment, the worry is not the wondrous addition of citizen media, which has its pros and cons, but it largely is a good thing, but the decline of full-time professional monitoring of powerful institutions. And we at the project have tried to figure a way to do a survey. I'm not even sure it's possible, maybe over the last 2 decades or so, trying to monitor the number of reporters literally on the ground in journalism, in mainstream journalism, in daily journalism, and compare that to the number of people they have to cover, like government officials, or even like public relations professionals who are brought in to affect and impact stories. And my guess is that the ratio of journalists to the people they have to cover is not getting better over time for the journalism business. The second question, and this is a little more controversial and a little more speculative, that I think is important to think about in this environment, is whether in this proliferating and fragmenting media universe, where you can tailor the news to fit your interests with one mouse click or a flip of the remote, whether we are losing the idea of shared truths and moving towards what some people have called a cafeteria-style pattern of news consumption, meaning you basically pick the news you agree with. The PEJ has called that the journalism of affirmation. There was a Pew poll that came out in the 2004 presidential election campaign. Now, obviously, passions and political passions are always exacerbated during election year. That had an interesting statistic. Those who said they got most of their news from the Fox News Channel favored George Bush over John Kerry by 70 to 21%. Those who said they got most of their news from CNN favored Kerry over Bush 67% to 26%. It's only one sample. There have been other polls that suggest similar things, that suggest clearly that Republicans are much more inclined to use something like Fox News. Democrats are much more inclined to use something like CNN. We can't dig too deep into it yet. We are not yet heading for a European system of overtly political and ideological mass media, and you get to pick and choose. But there are some dangers here. And I think one of the dangers is in a politically polarized environment, with the advent, frankly, of so much shouting head journalism or talk on cable, where we can have a debate about whether the sun rises in the east or the west these days, There is a kind of reluctance on the part of much of the mainstream media to vet the truth. Lou Urenick, our journalism department head at Boston University, said it in our roundtable discussion. He said, "Seek truth over balance." I think there's a reasonable concern these days that journalism is morphing from the mandate of seeking truth to settling for the idea of seeking some kind of balance, which can mean simply, if he said, then let's make sure she said. A few years ago, I covered a panel discussion on the eve of the 2004 Democratic National Convention in Boston that featured the three big national network news anchors. At that time, Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, and Peter Jennings, ironically, of whom obviously none of them are in their current posts anymore. And they talked about how their job had changed over the years. They were actually, at that point, defending the decision not to give any extensive nightly network news coverage of the convention itself. But they talked about how the business had changed over the years. And here's what Dan Rather, who, has made many quotable statements in his career, some of which seem a little unusual and some of which have more than a kernel of truth in them, who said this: "Fear has increased in every newsroom in America." He added that reporting on explosive issues can bring a torrent of angry emails and phone calls into your news organization. That can lead to a situation in which journalists conclude, this is what he said, that when you run this story, you're asking for trouble with a capital T. Why run it? Now, there's an ongoing and fair debate about what the impacts of this quote-unquote cafeteria-style journalism of affirmation are all about, and frankly, how big a problem it is. The project in recent years has decided that they think the threat is exaggerated, and they cite polls that say that most Americans say they want an independent and nonpartisan media. But I would just say that given the potential implications for our civic culture and our national discourse, that this particular potential byproduct of a fragmenting and transforming media universe would have huge implications on us as a nation and deserves continued vigilance. And on that note, I will stop.
We're going to have questions throughout the day, extensive questions from the group, but from the audience. Let's start right now. Several questions. Would you identify yourself, please?
Hi, Carl Thacker with Environmental Science and Technology. You were talking about the difference between CNN and Fox. That, is that implying that CNN is also as partisan as Fox is?
I wouldn't imply, you'd have to do a real content analysis to decide whether or not CNN is as partisan as Fox is. Personally, I have doubts about that. But what I do think it suggests is that conservatives or Republicans like Fox and go and watch it, and liberals and Democrats either don't like Fox or like CNN as alternative and tend to flock toward it. I think the Fox News Channel's image and reputation is fairly well understood by everybody. And it's not necessary, and I'm not making the case, I don't think the study makes the case at all, that if you were to look at the content, you would see them as polar opposites. I just think it's clear where people gravitate to. And I think the image and the reputation of Fox is well cemented in the minds of both conservatives and liberals.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Eugene Foley, Foley and Associates. You questioned the question of truth and balance. What is the truth?
The truth is, we're sitting in a room right now in Washington, D.C. More than that, it's hard to say. That's a very good question. I have always followed this in my own sort of journalistic. If I know, the truth is what actually happened, okay? The question becomes, how close can journalism get to that truth? One of the things that I actually think was interesting, and in many times, journalists can't get to the truth because they're not there. So how do you then try and find out what happened? Well, you go through second-hand and third-hand sources, and it then depends on how much you can believe and how much reporting can do. In lieu of knowing that you have the truth or finding out the truth, The next best thing is some level of objectivity and balance, which is why you see so many dueling quotes in stories. But let's take, for example, Hurricane Katrina, which I think a lot of people in my profession thought marked a turning point in the media's coverage in general and in the media's coverage of the Bush administration. Now, in retrospect, we have found out that some of that reporting and coverage was flawed. But on the other hand, let's look what happened here. A number of journalists were actually on hand. There was warning that this was going to be a major story. A number of journalists were actually on hand in the city of New Orleans or around the city of New Orleans when disaster struck. They saw things with their own eyes, and they experienced things with their own eyes, and in many cases, they were boots on the ground when there were no other boots on the ground. So if you listened to their reports, and some people, Anderson Cooper among them, have sort of made their reputation on this story, there was a different tone in how they reported. It was much more emotional and personal. There was the grilling of, for example, Michael Brown, the former FEMA head, in an interview by Soledad O'Brien of CNN, who said, "How is it possible that you didn't know that this was going on at the convention center?" That was an example of a case in which journalists, because they happened to be there, were quite certain that they had known and seen the truth. And therefore, you saw much more assertive journalism. In many cases, journalists can't get to the truth. In that case, fairness is the answer. But my concern is, and I think the thing that Dan Rather expressed, is that I'm not sure in many cases there's a concern, is getting to the truth really even the goal anymore in this kind of an environment where you really have organized and disorganized protests about any subject that is, politically volatile? Or are news organizations falling back to a default position that fundamentally says, hey, let's make sure everybody's heard on this one, and that's the best we can do, which is not the case.
Can we take two more questions, maybe? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Lauren Bell of CNA Corporation.
Lauren?
You spoke before about journalists receiving angry phone calls and letters if they present a story that they know is going to be controversial. When did this start happening, and what do you see the repercussions of this being?
I don't know when it started happening. I would say that if I had to guess, I would say that, and again, this is a guess, but I would say that some of it came with, I think, sort of the rise in talk radio and the power of talk radio. And the emergence of personalities like Rush Limbaugh. I can tell you, I was a former ombudsman at the Boston Globe. It was my job to field anywhere from 70 to 100 angry complaints a day about the newspaper for 2.5 years, at which point you need a nice long vacation and another job. And, you could actually tell, for example, on certain issues where there would be literally an organized response, where you could hear people reading from a script as they called and telephoned you, and you knew where it was coming from. So I think that if I had to suggest, I would say that it started probably to create heat and steam in the early 90s when you had powerful talk radio hosts who would say, if they're saying this about so-and-so, you call and write, your local newspaper. I would also say that there are some issues, for example, like the Middle East, in which passions run so high that, frankly, that predates anything like this. And I can say, again, as my experience as an ombudsman, there was nothing like, frankly, something akin to the current flare-up of violence in the Middle East to get partisans from both sides intensely angry at any media outlet you're showing too many casualties on this side or that side. But if I had to put a date on it, I would say probably in the last 10 or 15 years with the growth and strength of talk radio. The implications, I think, are the scary implications are that I think Rather's point is it now takes more courage to say, let's decide whether or not the administration is right or wrong on this. Let's decide whether or not this actually happened or didn't happen, because now there is a real downside. And when there's a downside and the risk of alienating the public in an environment in which news organizations are all worried about the bottom line, news organizations are all keeping their eye on the bottom line and the ball, then I think there's a greater fear that there is sort of a pulling back on let's try and get to the bottom of this no matter who we offend.
One last question. Joe Davis?
Joe Davis. I work for Society of Environmental Journalists, but I represent myself. I just want to invite you to take that truth versus balance paradigm and ask you if you can apply that to coverage of climate science. And maybe that's what the rest of the day is about, but I thought you might want a chance to take a swing at it.
Well, you know, and I knew that I was waiting for this one. Not that I have and it's a great question. I mean, and it's a very salient and relevant question. And the first thing I would say is, like most journalists who are basically general practitioners, I know very little about science. Having said that, I know that there is an argument that to the extent that this debate has become politicized, and it has, that there seems to still be an obligation, or the mainstream media still seems to feel, therefore, it's an argument, it's a political argument, and that's really what the story is, as opposed to saying there, you know, the overwhelming evidence scientifically suggests, you know, that there is a problem here. Now, my reading of the journalism here, and you guys can jump all over me on this, because I mean, it's not a subject that I follow as fanatically as I do some others. My overall reading of it is that there, if you do read carefully, that the body of evidence and that American journalism is coming to the conclusion that there is a significant problem here, and that's where the weight of evidence lies. That doesn't mean that the on the other hand aspect has already been eradicated from the stories. And that's, I think, in part because it's still considered a political argument, and you still have that problem.
Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
We're going to move right into the next panel, so if the panel members would go up to the podium.
Thank you all for being here again, and let me back up a couple of steps. I think I forgot to thank NSF and American Meteorological Society this morning in my introductory remarks, and there you have it. Thank you both for the support of this process and this project. We've broken the day up into two panels. The rules we established are that this is the set of questions that we'd like this first panel to address. That doesn't mean the discussion will be exclusively focused on this set of questions, but we certainly want to start off with this set of questions. And we're going to go down the panel and give each panelist no more than 5 minutes to address that panoply of questions that each of them has seen beforehand. And then open it up to a question and answer and a discussion format. So most of the morning should be taken up by questions and answers and discussions, and perhaps even questions related to what Mark just said too, as it bleeds into this panel here. If you can't see the entire set of questions behind me, I'll just read through them once very quickly. And the first one says, basically ask the questions of what's your personal evaluation of the media's coverage of reporting of climate science in particular, science in general, but climate science in particular on this occasion, and basically why? What's the basis for that conclusion? What are you basing that on? What's your experience? Secondly, where in your view do the media come up short? Many of the media. That's not to say that the media is singular. We all know it's plural. And people do a very good job in science all the way from that end of the spectrum to the other end, where people do a perhaps monstrously poor job of reporting and covering science. But where? I guess the question is, where do the media come up short on those occasions where they do come up short on the coverage and reporting of climate science, for example? And what can they attribute this to? What are they willing to sort of go out on a limb and say might be the root cause of this? We've all heard from Mark that media is changing in an unprecedented way. But I think the core concern here, at least one of the questions that we thought we'd raise here, is that perhaps it's better to spend more time focusing on journalistic standards and values. What happens to those over time? What are they? And what happens to them over time? As opposed to getting bogged down in a discussion about what form or forms media will take. Perhaps the more relevant question, I think, for this audience, or in this discussion anyway, is standards and values. What happens to them? Are there any, and what are they? And what are they likely to be in the future? Based on what Mark said, I'm not quite sure, and I'm not quite sure how journalism schools might respond to that. How can the science community play a role here with respect to this issue of standards and values, journalistic standards? Is there a role for the science community to help the journalism community enhance and nurture those values, especially media institutions? And last, I thought I'd throw in this question: are we in this age of unbridled information coming at us 24/7 from as many directions as we can count, are we more informed or less informed? And that's the set of questions we'll deal with. I think I'll start off to my right with Jerry Molman, go down this way, and then after each of the panelists is done, under 5 minutes, we'll open it up to questions and answers.
I have a copy of that.
Jerry?
I don't have to break my neck. Okay. What is my personal evaluation of the media's coverage and reporting of climate science in particular? What is the basis of your evaluation? I would say that I have a guarded opinion about the media's coverage of climate science because the relationship between us climate scientists, climate communicators, and the press is an edgy and uneasy one, I think, to virtually all of us, because it's kind of based upon a cultural gap, perhaps even a leverage gap, in that I take my friend here, Andy Revkin, as an example of that dynamic, and that my job is to educate the world, if you will, about human-caused climate warming, why it's caused, what the manifestations are, what the long-term implications are, what the global scale implications are, and that's really tough to stuff into a very short soundbite. And so I don't call up Andy and say, okay, this is my broad perception for the world today, Andy, you should write about it. No, obviously we're working on very different timescales. It just is the basis of that. And so in some of the workshops we've had before, there's always been kind of this a little bit of helpful myth that once we climate science writers and the climate communicators, climate science writers and the communicators, the climate scientists, is that it comes out as somewhat unbalanced. It's what I call a close but very unequal relationship, in that we don't call up the climate writers and say, hey, I have got a great new insight this morning, or I'm going to publish a paper. No, we consider that as fundamentally unethical. And for some, I think some very good reasons. At the same time, we have to be responsive, and are, to myriad calls from various climate science writers, okay, to help people shape their reporting priorities for the day and so forth. And so I think that the relationship is fundamentally unequal. The question is it dysfunctional? And my opinion is no, it's not dysfunctional. It's kind of close to this awkward, separate but equal kinds of an ethic there. I actually think that the media comes up short all the time. I would guess that the odds of somebody from the Associated Press is in the audience. Please don't identify yourself for your protection. But I think the obvious point is that when I read Associated Press, I immediately have a Pavlovian response of some kind because of the phenomenon which I call DWL, deliberately wimpy language. And the Associated Press, that's always there. Some scientists believe in the theory of global warming. Many scientists believe in the theory of global warming. Never does it say it is an overwhelming international scientific consensus that global warming is a real phenomenon. Okay, I dare you to find those kind of things. I think that once Seth Borenstein becomes part of the Associated Press, I suspect that ethic will change radically because he's not prone to wimpy language in my experience. I think it is an interesting challenge to us, of the challenge that was given to everybody, as the radical change of the media with time, largely because of economic and perhaps sociological pressures, or even ideological pressures. I don't know. I do believe that the science community can play a role in that. It's very, very clear that just as there's no longer a stereotypical single science writer, there's also not a single stereotypical scientist, climate scientist. We're all eclectic, different human beings, just like everybody else. And so we're inclined to interpret that differently. I do feel that there is an ethical trust that needs to be cultivated between the climate science communicators and the climate science writers. I also recognize that we're in an awkward situation right now because of a new phenomenon that I've noticed in the past 6 months, is that from the scientific community there is finally a bandwagon to have people in various scientific subcultures, colleges, universities, government places that had never done anything about addressing the problems of human-caused climate warming, that are now being egged on by their supervisors. How come our institution isn't relevant when all this other stuff is going on? It's a major...
Well, very quickly, Joe, and I think you want to comment
yeah.
too. Go ahead.
I just wanted to pick up on the technology question because I think that's hugely important. And I may have a view that's slightly different than some others here, but I actually think that the science isn't the story anymore. I think that the science that we need to know to make informed policy decisions we have. It's not to say that we shouldn't continue to do research on certain interesting questions, and there's still more to be found out, of course. But in terms of what we really need to know at this stage to move forward, I think that most of that is actually in place, and that the question really now becomes the one you posed: how can we address this through technology or other means? And I personally would like to see much more coverage of that, but again, it's difficult because I don't know exactly how that becomes a news story. I mean, so that's the question, I guess, is how does that become a news story? But there are certainly academics in this country who have been working on the question of technological solutions. There has been some attention to John Holdren's work, Sokolow and Pakula at Princeton. I mean, these kinds of people who are looking hard at the question, what kinds of responses could, in fact, help to solve this problem? And I really think that actually, that's where, in my opinion, the debate needs to shift to at this point, because I do believe the science is essentially settled.
Could I say a very, very quick addition to that very point?
But he's going to disagree.
No, I actually agree.
Did this scientist speak?
Naomi and I are both at UC San Diego. Bruce is from the San Diego Union Tribune. I have two objections to the term global warming. One is global, the other is warming. Those aren't the important parts. There are local climate change issues that I think Bruce's readers need to hear about. In San Diego, they include sea level rise and the disruption of the water supply and wildfire dangers and lots of others. And there's a barrier to getting to them because this false controversy continues to be hyped.
I just wanted to address your question about how do you have other reporters and other stories incorporate the correct science into their articles. We have a State House reporter who was writing about some initiatives by our governor and some legislation in progress in the state legislature in Sacramento. And he sent me a copy of the story, and we talked over the phone, and he said, I want to make sure I have the science right. It was just a couple of paragraphs. But I think that kind of collaboration is going to be critical within the newsroom. And I know it doesn't always happen, and maybe where I work is the exception rather than the rule, but I think those kinds of connections have to be made in every newsroom.
Andy Rifkin, then Bob Ryan, then John. I'm sorry, we have missed you for the second time. We'll get to you.
I just have to respond to Richard there for a second. The issue, this gets back to what Bruce was saying, though, when you get to the local and regional level, all the error bars expand. So there's not false controversy there. There's real uncertainty there.
Oh, quite right.
And that makes it, as a story, nearly impossible to tell.
I hear you.
In a newspaper.
I agree. Right there, Bob Ryan.
Bob Ryan from NBC4 here in Washington. I think we can't lose sight that while there may be a consensus that the science has been solved, that certainly the public response has not been solved. And so the story has to continue until there's a consensus within the public and an understanding and a better understanding. There will not be the shift from the science to the policy. And I think we can't lose sight either of the role that the local television stations do play. We've been talking about the general media, the print media to a large extent, books, but by and large, the only contact that the average person has day in and day out with science is through the local weathercast. Of probably half are meteorologists and half have been trained as journalism, but they play a meteorologist on television. But I think it's a tremendous resource, and so the weather climate boundaries have to be there and have to be considered when we're talking about climate. And indeed, as Richard mentioned, it's not global warming, it's global change. Much greater issues, but it all comes down to the local level. And it comes down to not who do you believe, but rather the local person who is presenting the daily weather and then may bring in some comments about climate from time to time is the person that is trusted. Not, and that's, so I think there's a whole opportunity there, if you will, and a responsibility that goes to making the person who ultimately will support any decision, that is the average person, a better understanding and more aware of these issues and able to make a decision, an informed decision.
Bob, I want to come back at you for 1 second. How do you deal with the tension within the newsroom higher up about so-called controversial topics? Because there is that tension.
Well, it's part of, I think, of having a background in science and to then finally get the understanding that if you're going to tell a story, that if the consensus is the story and not the two extremes on the edges of the distribution of the Gaussian distribution. So I think, finally that does come across that if there is a consensus, a 99.9% consensus, and that the debate is it going to be +2 in 50 years or +3 or 4? That is the story. Not is it happening or is it not happening? Right. So but it's a slow process. It's a slow process, and I think, the efforts of everybody to get some of the basic information out and to have the understanding that it is a consensus. But for the average person, it is still not an accepted that there is a consensus. It just don't. It comes down to, is it going to cost me more? Am I going to have to spend more money? Are my taxes going to go up? And if the answer is yes, then I don't believe it.
Right. John McCormick, right down the middle there. Then in the back, Rick Piltz, and then right there. We'll get to you.
Thank you. I'm John McCormick with the Energy Policy Center. I want to raise a subliminal issue. After the Supreme Court elected our president, there was a meeting in Washington where vested interests, corporate interests, came together and agreed, probably took a blood oath, we will never yield on the science. And I think that is what's sort of causing such controversy up on Capitol Hill, is there's always somebody who will take $1 to go up on the Hill and argue with their science credentials. So I'm going to make this subliminal issue a point of perhaps contention with Richard. We, as a species, are wired to climate change. That's why I have a furnace and an air conditioner in my home, and the clothing industry makes $1 billion on, just new garb for different seasons. However, global warming is what I have come to understand. I was thinking that climate change was a better issue, but because I thought clouds were going to cause the climates to change. But now ocean acidification tells me that the diminished sink in the oceans is going to add more CO2 to the atmosphere, is going to cause warming. If I were living now in Phoenix, I would say it's not climate change, it's global warming. And are we doing a disservice to continue to confuse the public about something they're so aware, climate's change, versus the Earth is warming? That's new.
Anybody on the panel? Richard, I'd be happy
Well,
to.
I don't want to monopolize the answers here, but it's.
Monopolizing the answers.
I think we're all struggling for better metaphors to make clear to the public that the human fingerprint is discernible now, and that the science community, as Naomi has said, has moved on from that point. And I'm fond of saying that because climate has always changed. It's true, from natural causes, and people have always, since the beginning of history, been spectators at this change. Now we're up on the audience, and we're part of the actors. That's one useful metaphor. Another is the forest fires caused by lightning issue. Sure, lightning causes lots of forest fires, but there are regions where people cause forest fires too. And if you combine careless campers and arson and the rest of it, then you can, I think, make it intelligible to many people that having humans as a cause, and now a prime cause of climate change, doesn't rule out the existence of natural climate change. You know, it's not an either-or thing. We actually have both. But I agree with you. There's a huge educational effort to go on.
Thank you. Jerry? I happen to agree with you that global warming is, in my view, a better term, simply because the physics that causes global warming is intrinsically global. We don't have all the CO2 piled up in a single column over Poughkeepsie, New York. You know, it's everywhere and ubiquitous. And so I think, and partly I also see some of the administration's language is called, they use the phrase climate variability and associated change. Is the, you know, the maximum wimpification possible to describe this. So I think that there are some real problems there. I think there's also deep pedagogical challenges that have not penetrated what I would call the intelligent lay public, which is most of you. I learned this as a Sigma Xi lecturer. I was supposed to give 3 lectures as part of this great honor, and I ended up giving 26. And every college I went to was essentially illiterate, whether it was the faculty or the students, about what global warming is really about. It had not penetrated anywhere in the curriculum from K through 20. Okay, and so I think that you have to start in a simple way of saying the problem is intrinsically global. It's caused by the infrared opacity of the planet, and therefore trapping of heat radiation. I call it the CO2 blanket for Earth, which is keep slowly, inexorably increasing. We also know that the onset of warming of the planet is very well underway. Over half a degree Fahrenheit has been banked globally. There's no longer a controversy about that, with much more to come over the next century. It isn't as okay, if we get our act together, we can fix this problem next Tuesday. You're kidding yourself if you think that that is what's going on. A lot of people think that if they can recycle their garbage, that somehow miraculously global warming is going to be. And the problem with that is that in order to arrest the momentum of global warming, we have to reduce CO2 emissions drastically over the next 2 decades if you really want to keep it from taking off on you. Jim Hansen calls that a tipping point. I think it was more of an inexorable march that is very difficult to stop. And so the requirement for reduced CO2 emissions is incredibly daunting. In fact, I don't think there's a single person in this room can change his or her lives by their personal habits. And I say that for the very simple reason that the ballpark number for how much you have to reduce the global emissions of carbon dioxide and keep them holding carbon dioxide constant in the atmosphere, you have to reduce emissions about 70 to 75%. Not 7 to 7.5, but 70 to 75%. That's a horrific number. How many people in this room can reduce their use of fossil fuels in everything you buy, every place you go, everything you heat, everything you cool? And so, again, the challenge is intrinsically global, and many of the impacts that this has on humans are hitting the poorest of people on Earth, okay? And I don't think we know how to solve that. And so I get a sense that sometimes that if we can just have a higher level of optimism, then we'll do all this good stuff and the problem will go away. The fact is it will take a very serious effort on part of the entire global community to put a dent into this or to slow its momentum. Because fundamentally, global warming and how it occurs in nature is a problem for your great-grandchildren, not for you. Almost everybody in this room will be dead by the time this problem really gets to ripping, because we don't know how to address that. People sometimes say that's too pessimistic. Well, yes, it is pessimistic because we could have started mitigating CO2 emissions 20 years ago. We didn't come close. In fact, we got worse and continue to get worse. And right now, the emissions of CO2 are still accelerating and expect to do so for a long time. That's not the warm and fuzzy story that people like to hear. Unfortunately, it's the truth. And if we're going to start dealing with the problem, it has to be based on that truth.
Rick, I want to call on you next. Rick Peltz. Just for that, I'll get a drink of water.
At Science Watch, yeah, there's plenty of scientific understanding of the problem. There's also plenty of understanding of, energy technology and other mitigation response strategies. But there's a high-level political problem with getting either the science embraced or the response strategies acted on. So my question is, it's mainly for the scientists on the panel. Oops. The assessments like the IPCC assessment or the National Climate Change Impacts Assessment process that's been suppressed by the administration is one of the main vehicles by which scientists step back from their immediate uncertainty questions to try to synthesize what they think they know. And these assessments are what should be used by policymakers and journalists as a basic template for understanding the problem. But they're systematically attacked politically. And when that happens, it seems that very often the science community does not have an effective way of responding to that. And is it really enough for you guys to say, well, it's just our job to do good science and good science education? I mean, doesn't the science community have more of a responsibility to step out more effectively as citizen scientists to directly challenge, and I'm talking right up to the level of the president, who systematically either ignores or denies or misrepresents the scientific understanding on global warming, to go to the media, I mean, to systematically call them down and correct the record, to perform kind of a keeping the public discourse honest function. Because right now the global warming denial machine has influence way out of proportion to its merit. Yeah. And it's partly because the scientists haven't gotten themselves together to deal with that political problem.
You mean as a form of communication from the science community, Rick? Because I want to...
Well, there doesn't seem to be an organized way of doing it. Like, for example, when the Bush administration, the White House operatives suppressed the National Climate Change Assessment, that was a very orchestrated activity. Right. Then when Revkin would go to the scientists, every scientist would have an idiosyncratic opinion about what they liked and didn't like about the methodology of the assessment, but there was no response from the science community that said, hey, it's not legitimate to call the national assessment junk science.
Yeah. Richard, is that, I'm going to ask you to answer that, but is that a vehicle, I mean, is that something in the panoply of things that have come up or at least been thought of about vehicles by which the science community can more effectively communicate, and perhaps at more effectively appropriate moments, or, is there a kind of framework here for something?
I'd actually like to hear from the journalists on this, but I'll say that I very much agree with Rick Piltz, and I very much admire his website, which I commend to all of you. And
that's climatesciencewatch.org.
Thank you, Richard. I'll take my $200 later. And I think this is a subject of discussion, and I'll tell you a little story. I was at a meeting in Aspen not long ago. Al Gore and John Kerry were there, and so were many leaders in many fields. And the purpose of the meeting was to move from the knowledgeability to action. And one group of people that I had very little contact with were leaders of evangelical religious communities, and they said that their membership were rather open to this message, having to do with stewardship of the earth and so on, but they didn't want to hear about it from scientists. We were the wrong messengers because we were regarded as being on the opposite side of too many issues, ranging from evolution and creationism to abortion and stem cells. And so that there was a question of who ought to deliver this message. It's the credible messenger that Bob Ryan was talking about recently. I think there's a need for that while we're waiting for the next Carl Sagan to come along.
Any response from the journalism community? Paul?
Is this on? Oh, it's on. My name is Paul Thacker. I'm with Environmental Science and Technology. We actually published a study. The lead author on it was Granger Morgan that reanalyzed the national assessment, and they found that it was fine. So for all of the 1,000 or 900 people that read my story about it, you're aware that that's the case. I wanted to ask Naomi, you earlier stated that there has been a concerted effort to undermine the science and attack scientists, and that some of this sprung out of similar issues with CFCs and smoking or tobacco. And I wonder if you could go into a little more detail about that. I mean, we do have one of the scientists here, Ben Santer, who was attacked in the mid-90s.
Yeah, well, Ben should probably tell you about his experience, but I can just say that some of the research I've been doing just has been tracking some of the individuals who have been involved in these different campaigns. And one feels very nervous about talking about this in public, because if you do discuss in public, you may be threatened with a lawsuit. But I'll talk about one thing that's a matter of public record. In 1995, the House held hearings on the question of CFCs and stratospheric ozone depletion. And at that hearing, two individuals who have been involved in the climate change denial, Fred Singer and Sally Baliunas. Sally Baliunas has a chapter in a recent book by the Marshall Institute that continues the same climate denial program. Both of them testified against the scientific consensus regarding stratospheric ozone. At that hearing, Fred Singer testified that there was no scientific consensus on the link between CFCs and stratospheric ozone depletion. That was in 1995. 3 weeks later, Sherry Rowland, Mario Molina, and Paul Crutzen won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for the demonstration of the link between CFCs and stratospheric ozone. Now, you don't win the Nobel Prize for work you just did the week before. That was a consensus that had actually been in place since essentially the late 1980s. It was based on work that they began in the 1970s. And by 1995, the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete stratospheric ozone had already been adopted and, in fact, signed by the U.S. administration. So this was a position that was completely at odds with what was both a political and a scientific consensus by 1995. And yet, nevertheless, this same individual comes back a few years later to deny the scientific consensus on climate change. He's been quoted as a credible contrarian or skeptic, or whatever word you prefer. He's been quoted in many newspapers, many magazines, on many online sites. And often he's quoted as credible because he does have some scientific credentials. He is a physicist by training, got his PhD in the 1950s at Princeton, worked in the rocket science program, was the first chief scientist of the National Weather Service in the 1960s. So once upon a time, this was a man who was an active member of the scientific community, did research, wrote scientific papers. But that was a long, long time ago. he trades on that scientific credibility, even though it's been a long, long time since that credibility should really be viewed as legitimate. That's one example. There are many others, and I'd be happy to talk about it in private with anyone who's interested. And maybe we can, I don't know if Ben wants to talk about his experience or not.
Okay, I'm going to go this way. Alexandra, and then I'm going to Dave, and then Dale. I'm sorry, Dale, I just haven't gone to this side. In that order.
Thanks. I'm Alexandra Tietz. I work for Congressman Henry Waxman from California on the House Government Reform Committee. And I just wanted to follow up on this discussion about the problem of the misinformation campaign and the people who are participating in that. In the tobacco context, Congressman Waxman, I think, was actually influential in sort of debunking some of that by hauling the tobacco executives up before Congress and being able to have them under oath and show sort of the extent of the disinformation campaign. We haven't had an opportunity to do that in the same way in the climate context. And following on Kaylee's question of, point about the level of misinformation, especially among editors and board members and owners, my question is sort of how much, particularly from the journalist perspective, how effective has the misinformation campaign in climate science, or how effective is that continuing to be? Obviously, it's been very effective in creating uncertainty. How do we best counter that, particularly sort of at the higher levels of the news organizations?
Let me respond very quickly, Alexandra, and then I'll let the members of the panel respond. I'm hearing at least what I think to be the case, that is the question to be begged, why hasn't the media covered this campaign in more detail? Is that part of what's coming out here?
Would that be the best way to, is the best way to respond to ignore them?
Okay.
Is the best way to respond to ignore them, to highlight their activities? And we had a hearing last week in the Energy and Commerce Committee just trying Dr. Michael Mann in absentia, and we're having a follow-up hearing to try him in person on how his 1998 study has misled the world on climate change. There was very little coverage of the first hearing, for better or worse. And in some ways, it's nice to know that no one took it seriously. On the other hand, that was a very deliberate attempt to discredit a particular scientist and the entire work on climate change. So how do we best address those things from the media's perspective?
It's not really my place to counsel you as to how to counter it, but I would certainly feel comfortable in counseling you that it is not going to go away anytime soon. Just for laughs, we have a very elaborate search engine that can pretty much rip through every newspaper in the world. And I did a search a few weeks ago in the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine. Their famous survey, you may recall, it came out, I believe, in 97 or 98, where via postcards and online, climate scientists numbering some 17,000 signed up to deny that climate change was not a problem. It was later revealed that among the climate scientists who signed up were the Spice Girls. Yours truly, it was pretty easy to sign up, and nobody really asked me if I was a climate scientist. I'm certainly not. And the entire cast of MASH, including the noted climate scientists, Drs. Pierce, McIntyre, Professor Radar O'Reilly, and on down the list. And I found that about once a month in a local opinion column or in a letter to the editor somewhere in the world, that survey is still cited as the smoking gun evidence that climate change is a hoax, which I believe is a term from where you work in Congress, although not necessarily from yourself or your boss. I'd also like to mention something that Rick mentioned earlier, which seemed to be, if I heard you correctly, a suggestion that scientists should be better organized to counter this. In my experience, scientists and journalists, for that matter, are probably two of the most ill-suited groups to organize together, ranking up there with house cats and Democrats, with all due respect. I don't see that happening, and I would have to suspect that for most scientists, they do not and should not see that as their place in this debate.
If I could just add, can I just add one thing also about that, because you had asked about the tobacco connection, and the Oregon Institute reminds me I didn't say anything about that, but the Oregon Institute petition was sent out with a cover letter that was signed by Frederick Seitz, a former president of the National Academy of Sciences. The Academy was quite upset that the letter made it seem as if they had endorsed this petition, which in fact they had not. Frederick Seitz was the principal advisor to R.J. Reynolds in the late 1970s and early 80s in their program to support and sponsor scientific research that would cast doubt on the links between tobacco and cancer. And during the 1980s, he became a major author of reports challenging the scientific consensus on global warming, challenging the scientific evidence. So it's a very clear pattern. And I guess one thing that I think the scientific community hasn't done enough of is to speak up against this kind of behavior by people among their own ranks. And I know this is a very tricky and difficult issue. The scientific community doesn't excommunicate people, and that's probably a good thing overall. But you know, when I've spoken to people about this, I mean, a lot of people just don't know. A lot of people just don't know, including a lot of scientists. But there are certainly people in the scientific community who are aware of these activities. But the scientific community has never come out, as far as I know, in any way in saying that these people really have crossed, you know, a whole set of ethical, intellectual, and conceptual boundaries, and that their positions are really untenable.
I think the analogy from the science perspective, one could argue perhaps the same set of standards might apply in the journalistic community as well. I think Phil Myers has mentioned this many times. In other words, is there a mechanism for identifying people that have fallen outside the norms of journalism? And I don't. It's not a resolved issue, but it's certainly up for discussion. Dave, and then Dale, and then the gentleman there.
Dave Hawkins, Natural Resources Defense Council. Most of this morning has been focused on the important topic of how to cover this issue of the level of science consensus. And I want to suggest perhaps another project that I think the science community and journalists could pursue that would be more productive. Our research indicates that when people read an article about the science and whether there are arguments about it, they don't adjudicate who's right. They just come away with one factoid, which is there's a fight. And to get beyond that, I think that the journalism community would be doing a huge service if it would have a basically prolonged education campaign about why the global warming problem doesn't fit the traditional pollution control paradigm, why you can't make sensible policy by waiting until all the evidence is in and then fixing on the cause and then turning the faucet and the problem goes away. That's not the global warming problem. The global warming problem is much more like the supertanker that's in a fog bank where there are known to be reefs. And if you wait for the engineer to tell you that you've hit the reef, you can't fix the problem. And that explanation of inertia in the system, both that energy investments last very long times and that the emissions, once in the atmosphere, stay there for a very long time, hammering away at that explanation about why the current policy approach is fundamentally misguided, even if you assume that there are some facts that remain to be resolved, I think would be a huge service. And it's the kind of thing that the board of directors of media companies get. They get the argument that if Iran has the capacity to enrich uranium, you don't wait until Iran has the bomb to decide what to do about it. You have to engage ahead of time. Whether you agree or disagree with what we're doing there, they understand the idea that if you wait until the problem has been demonstrated and documented and accrued, you have lost or eliminated many of your options to be able to respond intelligently. And getting that message across to the public is something I think that the journalism community could do and should do.
Peter, Richard?
Well, I'd like to say I very much agree, and there's a quote that Sherry Rowland, the Nobel laureate, made. His paper came out in 1974. That's what he won the Nobel Prize for. But around the late 70s, he was fighting DuPont and the chemical industry, which by that time had not yet come around to the view that A, it was an issue, and B, you could profitably make CFC substitutes. And Rowland said famously in the New Yorker, what's the use of developing a science to the point where it can make useful predictions if then all you're willing to do is stand around and wait for them to come true? I think that's very germane today.
Here's the way I'm going to close this off. Dale Willman, gentleman behind him, gentleman in back, and that gentleman there. The last 4 questions, and I hope the answers are succinct as well.
Hi, Dale Willman. I run an environmental journalism nonprofit, and in a previous life spent many years here in Washington with CBS and CNN and National Public Radio, and many other 3-letter acronyms. I wanted to respond quickly to one of the previous questions first, and that was the idea of compartmentalization amongst the media. And I want to point out that it's common in gatherings like this to forget that the prestige press, the Andy Revkins, have the luxury of, and I know you don't feel luxurious, Andy, but the ability to actually focus on an issue, one particular issue. The majority of the media in this country, however, does not have that luxury. Most journalists are, as I was for much of my career, which is to say generalists. When I was in my early 20s in Columbus, Ohio, working for the #1 radio station there, I had to cover school busing, an issue I had no clue about, and yet I had to cover a very serious issue for that community, and I fell back on that old journalist dodge, which is what I now call drive-by journalism, but he said, she said journalism. You get one quote from one side, one from the other, and that's how you cover an issue you don't know a lot about. So scientists need to understand that about most media out there, other than the New York Times, the LA Times, some of the other papers, and try and find a way to address that and to help educate those journalists, both the journalists and the gatekeepers, on these issues so that they have a better understanding and can report on them more adequately.
There's an old cartoon, I was going to say, there's an old cartoon that I saw in a newsroom years ago with a guy sitting at his desk and he's throwing darts at a dartboard and what he's going to be an expert on today. And so.
It's absolutely true. I want to challenge a little bit what my friend Peter was saying earlier about in what is, I think, typical of journalists to be a little cynical and dark about the way they view the public. In the discussion about books and what people are reading. And I would say that people don't gravitate to crap necessarily because that's what they want, but in part because that's what's out there. But to put perspective on it, as Mark did with Larry King and with O'Reilly and the actual numbers, to have a bestseller, what are you talking, 100,000 books, 150,000 books? A million books is huge in the book publishing industry. So even though Ann Coulter makes a lot of money off these books, she's not necessarily reaching all that many people. I want to look at the other side of that, the State of the Media report that Mark talks about and his group put out. In the last report, the 2006 report, talks about 3 different media which are actually doing better. Most media are beginning to tank and have been tanking for quite some time, but there are 3 areas that are doing well. The first one is minority media, and I think that's more recognition that minorities actually spend money in this country. So now finally the media is catching on to that and seeing a marketing value here. But the other 2 are more significant. It's alternative media and public radio. Alternative media is growing rapidly. Public radio is now listened to by 30 million people every week in this country. So that's 10% of the population. When you take out the kids and look at sentient human beings, that's a huge chunk of America that listens to public radio. And I would argue that the reason this is happening is because alternative media and public radio are actually creating relevance still in our lives. They're showing those connections that Bruce was talking about. So I guess my question, very long-winded to Bruce and Peter and everybody up there, is how do we create this relevance once again on these issues and show that relevance to our listeners and to our readers? Because I think many of them are smart enough to get it if we can show those connections.
Can we get one person on the panel to respond to that question? Peter, would you be the person?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that. And Dale, you forced me to get my back up and be a militant cynic now. It is a challenge. The rule of thumb in TV, for example, is that is the one set by Don Hewitt in the most successful TV show of all time, 60 Minutes. You don't have a story if you don't have a person. That is still a challenge with climate change. There may be some climate change stories out there, for example, about scientists who are being harassed. Hanson's story actually, compared to other aspects of the larger climate change story, just got a lot of play in the past year. While I'm gratified to know that alternative media is growing and that public radio is growing, in terms of sheer numbers and who it's reached, it's getting its clock cleaned by reality television. One of my favorite modern-esque cliches. You learn reality from reality television, just like going to an adult bookstore makes you more of an adult. I remain cynical, but I also remain heartened by the things you point out and some of the great work that is being done out there that I shouldn't deny the existence of. There is great work at every level.
Morning Edition, all things considered, have more listeners than most of those reality shows have viewers. They're the number 2 and number 3 radio programs in the country, unfortunately behind Rush Limbaugh, but they're still number 2 and number 3.
Bruce, real quick.
I just want to add something very quickly. When you talk about making the climate change story relevant to people, in the West, the biggest issue is water and declining snowpack and what that's going to mean for people on the ground. You know, if they're going to go into the store and buy bottled water, it's going to be $2, $3, $4 a gallon in the future. So I think there are ways, despite the uncertainties in the modeling of projections, where you can really make it relevant to people's day-to-day lives.
I'm sorry to hasten this process up, but I am going to take these last 3 questions and be succinct on both ends.
My name is Rahul Singh. I'm from India, a journalist. I've been invited to by the Woodrow Wilson to this seminar. I'd like to bring a third world perspective to this debate. We've just been told that human activity has led to the climate change. Now, most of this human activity has been in the developed world, not in the developing world. And it's led to economic development, hasn't it, in your countries? Now, India and China want also economic development, countries like India and China. And you're now asking them to stop the kind of human activity that has led to development in your countries without you changing your lifestyles. You're asking these countries to change their lifestyles. Is that a fair demand to make when you have developed with this kind of human activity, which you're now saying is causing climate change? You're asking these countries, which are now trying to develop in the same way as you've developed, to change their lifestyles.
That's, I think, a fairly long answer, or at least a sort of involved answer.
10 seconds.
Anybody? Richard, take a shot at it.
I'll take a shot. It's exactly right. I mean, that's why this is a global issue. It's why it is an ethical issue. It's a moral issue. And I think that's why it's why the Kyoto Protocol did initially focus on the Annex I nations for precisely that reason. And it's why the position of the United States right now is, in my view, morally irresponsible. We've created this problem through the use of fossil fuels. As you said, our prosperity has been built on the use of fossil fuels, and we have an obligation to address it. That's my view.
Richard, very quickly.
I think you're right, and I think it's why Gore is right in saying that political leadership is the key issue that's missing internationally, because the strong reductions in fossil fuel CO2 emissions that are going to be necessary are going to require huge technology developments, from safe nuclear to carbon sequestration, a whole list of them. And that's not going to happen unless the industrial world thinks that there's going to be political leadership and political sanctioning for it. So I think you're very much right, and that's the way the world has to proceed.
Right up back. Yep.
My name is Eric Roston. I'm an independent journalist, but I'm speaking on my own behalf. And in April, I left Time magazine to write a book about scientific literacy. And I'd be curious to know from each of you, or as many as possible, what would you say is the one factoid that your average newspaper reader is unlikely to know about global warming, but should know. Just one more thing, Tony mentioned about graduate schools and journalism before. I think with the media in decay, those are more important now than ever.
Can we go down the panel and answer that question? Is there a factoid that's not out there that should be out there?
Start down at Jerry.
Jerry.
I think there's a mega factoid that is just finally crept into the daily press, and that is the already onset of relentless acidification of the ocean. Carbon dioxide devolves in the ocean, becomes carbonic acid, lowers the pH, increases the acidity of the ocean, therefore, in principle, threatening essentially all marine life in the global ocean. So to me, that's the monster that people haven't been willing to talk about yet, but is now splattering out in a sort of episodic way. Naomi?
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that. I'll add a historical one. The President's Science Advisory Committee predicted in the 1960s that discernible climate change would be evident by the end of the century. That prediction has come true.
Richard? Peter, sorry.
I think our colleague from India has just raised it. We tend to think of these things on a national level when they're a global problem, and there are 2.5 billion people in India and China alone who are poised to accelerate their contributions to it, and the solution is not to shut them down from what we already have in the developed world.
I think people don't realize the long time scale and global nature. They don't understand that the molecule of carbon dioxide that came out of your tailpipe yesterday will be in the atmosphere for 100 years, which is plenty of time for the wind to equalize it. So the CO2 concentration anywhere on Earth is the result of what all 6 billion of us have done. And it's not going to be solvable unless all 6 billion of us are on the same page.
Bruce?
I think the ocean acidification problem is a big one that our readers haven't gotten yet. I'm working on something. But I also think that the idea of what is settled science and what the uncertainties are, despite what I've written so far already, doesn't seem to be reaching people.
Is that, yes, you've got the last question.
Okay.
I'm sorry, it's taken me a long time to get to you.
Thank you. Ed Goldstein, I'm a doctoral student at George Washington researching the government's Earth Science program, which there are big issues about, and there's a National Academy's decadal survey going on for Earth Science. Some of the issues are like the delays in NPOS, the National Polar Orbiting Environmental Satellite, funding issues, which government agency is in charge of climate change, and how much the government research program can do to deal with some of these questions, like will there be a tipping point? My question is, how much attention do you think there will be to the government research program, because there is more attention now to the climate issue, and can you evaluate media coverage of what the government research program is doing?
Sure. Yeah, this is actually a deadly question. I don't know if you meant it to be a deadly question, but I served on the National Academy of Sciences committee to evaluate the Bush's climate change science plan. And one of the places we were meeting at the Academy, I asked one of the leading individuals that was running climate change science plan, I said, what is the President's budget request for adaptation and coping with climate change? And the reply was, oh, we can't tell you, that's classified. And I said, excuse me, but I turned over 16 years of budget requests in NOAA in my life, and the President's budget request is not classified. It's his request. Congress is the one that puts us around. And so, and then after the 2001 Academy report that Ralph Cicerone shared, there was also a statement by Bush, who commissioned the report, that they would not focus on mitigation because we don't believe that's true, but we're going to focus on adaptation to global warming. Well, that was 4 years ago, and we ain't seen anything since. Okay, there is no budget for coping and adaptation to climate change in the U.S. federal budget, to the best of my knowledge. Rick Pills may have a more concise answer than I do. But anyway, it's essentially the climate community got stiffed in that process. I suggest that we break for lunch, finally. And thank you very much for sticking with us this morning. I know we could go all day with the questions. Just hang on a minute.